We are going to get started. Welcome, everybody, to our book release celebration for We the People. I'm Steve Hoberman. I'm the director of Technics Publications, and I love these book release celebrations. And I love them for three reasons. One reason is that it gives an opportunity to take a newly released book and make our readership aware that this book is now available. And also celebration, where we can actually celebrate a very big event, because writing a book is no small task. So much goes into it. Imagine putting together 30, 40, 50,000 words, and then going through several iterations of editing and all the work that goes into producing a book. So we're here to celebrate that event as well. And the third reason why I love these events is for insights into the author, kind of getting into the author's brain a little bit and learning more about why did an author write this book? What was the drivers? What are the key messages? So I love these book release celebrations for those three reasons: awareness, celebration, and insights. And very happy today to introduce Kathy Rondon, who wrote We the People, a playbook for data ethics in a democratic society. And Kathy is a data governance practitioner, educator, and thought leader with over 30 years experience in data and information management. Her professional focus has long been data governance in the public sector, where she has spent much of her career. She's a frequent speaker at data governance conferences. She has one coming up in December, and was the recipient of DAMA International's 2021 Award for Excellence in Data Management for her work on data governance education. Very pleased to introduce Kathy Rondon. Kathy, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate you putting together this book celebration. So should I just get started with my slides, with my presentation? I think I mentioned to you earlier that I'm pretty light on slides. I'm a minimalist when it comes to slides, but I do have a few. So so let's just get started.
Be great, yeah.
So a little bit more about the author. That's me. As Steve mentioned, I am a longtime public sector data practitioner. That's my background. But I am not a techie. My degrees are in English literature and international relations. So I come at this very much from a policy and procedures, protocols kind of background, not from a technical data modeling or data management background. I have spoke at Dataversity conferences on data governance and data ethics. I spend an awful lot of time doing training on data governance, and I am a first-time author. This is my first book, and it was a wonderful experience. So I want to thank Steve for making it such a smooth process. It was wonderful. I can't say enough good things about Technics Publications and Steve making the process as easy as possible. So yes, it was hard work, but it could have been harder. So why did I write this book? One of the things that Steve said was, some insights into why and how this book came into being. Well, starting in about 2010, I started attending data-related conferences, and I noticed something. I started reading and read for many years data-related articles and blogs, and I noticed something. And then again, not just specific data-related topics, I also was reading and listening to the mainstream news. Also noticed something. So what was I noticing? Almost all data-related project and Outlook pieces, a little bit less now, but certainly when I started this process many years ago as sort of diving into data governance, those pieces were focused on monetizing data and digital transformation to save money and effort. Now, that's not to say those things are not important, but the lion's share of the focus was about, it was really a lot of enthusiasm for the opportunities that data gave us. And I thought that was important, but not a sufficient treatment of the topic. Because at the same time, there were increasing media reports of misuse of data, or simple lack of consideration of the impact that projects had on real people. And almost without fail, there was something along the lines in these media reports of, well, we could not have foreseen, or this was unexpected. And every time I read one of those articles, I said, well, it's not that hard to foresee, and it's not that hard to consider. People just didn't. The people were so caught up in the opportunities and the possibilities that data offered them that they forgot to ask some of the really basic questions. And so I was noticing that. I also noticed that when data ethics was mentioned, in the instances that it was mentioned, it almost always was limited to the realm of privacy protection. And again, don't want to minimize the importance of privacy protection, but it was also, I felt, an incomplete treatment of the topic of data ethics. The data ethics is so much bigger than just, is somebody collecting your data and using it without your permission? That is certainly a topic, not the only one, that needed to be considered. So as over time, I had the same reaction to this, to data conferences and data pieces and news media reports over and over again. And so I thought, I feel like I have something to say on this topic. So how did I approach it? Well, I had a lot of practice thinking about writing and implementing policy for data collection and handling. I spent decades doing this in public sector environments. I also have a predisposition towards reasoning by analogy, and I naturally gravitated towards stories and examples from news reports and personal experience. And I also had a network of individuals that I had talked to over a period of years about the shoulds rather than the cans of data collection and handling. So pulling all of that together at the same time, and I don't have a bullet point on this, but around the same time, a couple of years ago, when I really started thinking about, I need to write a book on this topic, I read Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction. And I thought, yes, this is what I need. This is what I need to say. This is what I want to say, but not on AI and data science, on data ethics, because what she did and how she treated that topic really kind of spoke to me. So at that point, a structure started forming in my head, and I called a friend of mine, another author that Steve has worked with on multiple occasions, and said, I want to write a book. I have an idea, kind of have a structure for it. Can you introduce me to your publisher? And that's how this relationship was born. And at that point, I really started calling my network of individuals and asking them, I'm writing this book on this topic. Can I interview you? Can I ask you about this specific topic? And are you willing to be quoted in this book? And so I interviewed several people. So the sources for the books, the stories that I have, are sort of a combination of news reports that I've read about and cited, and personal experience for people in my network of colleagues and collaborators. And so that's sort of how I did the approach. And I think, I think the narrative, I feel happy. I feel pleased with how the narrative evolved using that approach. So, one of the things that I wanted to make clear is that, what do I hope to accomplish? Well, I do not hope, it's not my intention to provide an answer. It's rather to generate the right questions. And there's a series at the end of every chapter, there is a series of questions on that topic. What are the ethical questions that a practitioner needs to ask to ensure that they are using ethical data practices? It's not to provide a compliance checklist, but to suggest rather an ethical framework. And that framework, one of the things that that I realized after talking to some of my colleagues who did sort of first line reviews for me was that I was missing the overarching framework. I had a really great set of stories to tell, and the questions and the advocacy points, but I lacked an overarching ethical framework. So at the end of the book, I bring together all of those stories and everything that we've talked about and suggest 5 dimensions of data ethics that that provide that sort of overarching framework for what an ethical data practice should look like. And then, at the end of the day, it's really not my intention to provide the definitive work on data ethics, but rather to start an ongoing conversation. And that's really kind of what this book is supposed to be, is more of a conversation and a discussion of what the evolution and development of data ethics should look like in a democratic society. So that's basically the background. And I would like to read a quick excerpt of in the book that, let's see. This particular excerpt is from the chapter entitled Ensure Domestic Tranquility. Maybe I should back up a little bit. The book is actually entitled We the People because it is structured after the preamble to the Constitution. There is a chapter on We the People, a chapter on in order to form a more perfect union, one on established justice. This one is on ensuring domestic tranquility. And so all of the stories that are associated and the examples that are associated with the book are organized as, as it relates to the preamble to the Constitution, being a seminal democratic society work. So this is an excerpt from Ensure Domestic Tranquility. And I think that it sort of exemplifies the way that the narrative works. As a data ethics question, should companies be allowed to make access to critical technologies conditional on users having to agree to indiscriminate data collection and complete lack of control over what is done with that data afterwards? There are those who will argue that the providers of services that are optional should be allowed to define the parameters for access, and that if people don't like the terms, they can go elsewhere for the service. Let's leave aside for a moment the practical matter that reading every privacy statement and terms and conditions document to every application that even the moderate user of technology employs would take over 6 40-hour work weeks. Let's try a thought experiment to answer the question from an ethical standpoint. First, imagine you are a seamstress who lives in 19th century New York or Chicago. You are required to work 16-hour days with 1 bathroom break in an unventilated warehouse. The garment factory owner notes that people voluntarily agree to these work conditions and are free to leave and work elsewhere if they do not like the conditions of employment. But every garment factory in the city has the same conditions because there is neither a legal requirement nor business incentive to do otherwise. Do you, the seamstress, actually have a choice, and are you actually providing consent for these conditions? As a data ethics issue, companies that require you to agree to terms and conditions for data collection and third-party sharing and use the fig leaf that the consumer can go elsewhere if they do not agree to the terms and conditions are typically well aware that every other company has very similar terms and conditions. This consumer really doesn't have much of a choice. In much the same way that often violent unionization efforts, antitrust legislation, and fair labor standards change the conditions that the 19th century seamstress was forced to accept, the environment for fair data collection and use is currently under what can only be termed a societal renegotiation. This is what ensuring domestic tranquility means in the 21st century. So, Steve, that is really all I have in terms of what I wanted to say. I do have some backup slides if there is appetite for discussing dimensions of data ethics in more detail. But I think maybe I will pause there and see if you and our participants have any questions or comments or suggestions or observations.
Yeah, that sounds great. By the way, Kathy, I love that part of the book. I remember that very well. And I remember there are other parts of the book too, where you're able to bring in stories from outside the world of data and connect them, like the Westwood story. And then there was one or two other stories, even like when you were talking about bathrooms, female and male bathrooms in the
Oh,
beginning.
yeah.
It was such a good connection there. And something else I really loved about the book is I love how you're not just telling a story about ethics. There are parts of the book where you actually do your own research. You're in a situation and you really like to know, okay, what is this organization or this reseller doing with the data? And you track down it yourself and you share the kind of responses you're getting from these organizations. I found that really interesting too.
I did a fair amount of Freedom of Information Act requests for public records about data contracts and data agreements. And the responses from various different levels of government was kind of eye-opening.
Very cool. Does anyone have any other questions here? I see quite a few friends on our participant list. If anybody has any questions for Kathy about the book. Do you see this being the first of a series of books?
Perhaps, I think that you and I have talked about sort of some additional, follow-on books, and so we've discussed it. I will admit that I don't have sort of an outline in my head for the next book right now, but I think that you and I have certainly discussed the possibility of continuing this conversation, or sort of going off and similar parallel discussion threads.
Yeah, once you start writing a book, you just want to keep going. It becomes almost like an addiction, writing addiction. Great. All right.
Truly enjoyed writing it. It was a lot of fun.
Very glad to hear.
Steve and Kathy, I'd be interested in seeing the data ethics dimensions.
Sure.
In a few minutes. I did have one question. You mentioned you raised a bunch of questions, but you don't really give any answers. But in this example you just gave, it sounds like at least you give some indications of what a reasonable answer might be. But to what extent would somebody need other materials to, if they're doing a data project and want to apply data ethics, would they need other materials to help find the right answers?
Well, in addition to the ethical questions at the end of every chapter, there are some call-out boxes on opportunities to advocate for better laws, better regulation, or better policies. And so I do make suggestions. What's missing is not necessarily, additional material, academic material or books. What's missing in many cases is the context. How you are going to approach a data ethics policy in a private sector organization working in healthcare is going to be a little bit different than a public sector organization working in national security. So a lot of what is missing, and one of the reasons I don't suggest specific sort of checklist compliance, is that the compliance regimes and the compliance frameworks vary wildly from industry to public sector and in different industry sectors. So I put in questions and I put in call out boxes for suggested sort of advocacy and areas for people to become active in and developing new policies and procedures, and even advocating for new laws and regulations at different levels of government. But I don't provide specific answers in the sense that this is what you need to do, because the context is so important.